"Can I clean your house for a plate of food?" But when the millionaire saw her, he froze. The Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia wore a quiet stillness that only early November could bring. Twilight had just fallen, mist drifting gently across the hills, and the wind whistled through the pines like nature's whisper. Inside a secluded mansion tucked deep within the woods, Daniel Whitmore, a retired architect, passed his days in solitude, haunted by the tragedy that had shattered his life 5 years earlier when his wife and young daughter died in a horrific car accident. The grand house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with silence. Only the ticking of clocks and the rustle of old papers filled the air when Daniel sat in his study. He welcomed no guests, saw no friends, only his lawyer and a housekeeper who visited a few times a week. His world revolved around dusty blueprints, fading memories, and endless quiet evenings that felt more like echoes of a life once lived. And then, on one bitterly cold afternoon, the doorbell rang, sharp, unexpected, cutting through the silence of the house like a distant thunder. Daniel frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. On the door monitor, he saw a young woman, disheveled, holding a child in her arms. Her face was streaked with dirt, her clothing worn and frayed from the cold. He assumed she was a door-to-door solicitor or someone asking for donations. But something in him, some quiet instinct, made him pause. It was as if destiny itself stood on the other side of the door. He opened it. Standing before him was a woman in her late 20s. She was trembling, not just from the wind, but from shame and exhaustion. She wore a tattered coat, old jeans, and sneakers that looked like they'd walked too many hard miles. In her arms, she held a little girl, no more than 4 years old, her soft blonde curls resting against her mother's shoulder as she slept peacefully despite the cold biting at their skin. The woman lifted her eyes, green, filled with desperation. Her voice was unsteady, as though she was holding back tears. "Please, would you let me clean your house in exchange for a little food for my daughter? We haven't eaten in 2 days." Daniel stood frozen, unable to respond. A strange emotion stirred within him, something he thought long buried. Before he could say anything, the little girl stirred in her mother's arms, slowly opening a pair of tired blue eyes, eyes he'd seen before, in the face of his own daughter. Time stood still. Daniel tried to remain composed, but inside his heart was pounding so loudly it nearly drowned out the howling wind outside. Those eyes, the deep clear blue, wide and innocent, were the same eyes he had once looked into every day, 5 years ago. His daughter's eyes, Emily's eyes. Now they stared back at him from the face of a child he had never seen before. He stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, both of you. It's too cold out here." Lena hesitated, unsure if the man truly meant it, but maternal instinct pushed her forward. She stepped inside, carrying Sophie close to her chest. The warmth of the house made the little girl's face soften. She rubbed her eyes, clinging to her mother's neck, and then turned to look at Daniel. She stared at him for a long moment. Then softly, almost in a whisper, she said, "Daddy." Daniel froze. A chill ran down his spine. That voice, it wasn't just the word she used. It was the tone, the melody of it. Unmistakably familiar. Exactly how Emily had said it when she was that age. He led them into the living room, the only space in the house that still held a hint of warmth thanks to a softly crackling fireplace and a few old books scattered on the table. Lena gently sat Sophie down on the sofa. The little girl sat quietly, clutching a worn-out rag doll, likely her only toy. Daniel couldn't look away from her. Every movement she made, the way she tilted her head, the furrow of her brow when observing unfamiliar things, it all mirrored his daughter. Lena noticed his gaze and pressed her lips tightly together. "She sometimes confuses people. She misses her dad. He passed away," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, but in his heart, doubt was already turning into obsession. How could it be? The resemblance wasn't just physical, it was behavioral, emotional, even that small birthmark on her right cheek. It was all too exact. He stood, walked over to a framed photo on the wall, an old picture of him, his wife, and Emily at age 4. When he turned back, his eyes met Sophie's. She was looking at the photo too. "That little girl looks like me," Sophie said with a soft smile. Daniel turned to Lena. She had gone pale. After Lena and Sophie had finished their dinner and settled into the guest room, Daniel returned to his study, his mind heavy with questions. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating old blueprints and faded memories he had tried so hard to bury. But tonight, those memories clawed their way back with a force he could no longer ignore. He sat down in his worn leather chair, opened the bottom left drawer, and pulled out a small metal box, its lock stiff with years of disuse. He hadn't touched this box in ages, because inside were the documents tied to the accident that had taken his wife and daughter from him. His hands trembled as he opened it. The scent of old paper filled the room, tinged with the grief of a past he had never truly escaped. One by one, he pulled out the files, hospital reports, police summaries, and read them, not with sorrow now, but with a sharpened gaze. He wasn't just grieving anymore, he was suspicious. And then he saw it. A handwritten note in the margin of a hospital report. Identification difficult due to condition of the body. DNA verification needed. Daniel frowned. He didn't remember ever seeing this note. Why hadn't he noticed it before? He kept digging. Then he found it, a form requesting a DNA test, signed by him. But next to it was another sheet stamped "Canceled." The reason, canceled at the family's request. What family? He had never canceled any test. Someone had done it in his name. Daniel sat frozen, his eyes locked on the papers, a storm of emotion building beneath the surface. In his mind, Sophie's face reappeared, those eyes, that smile, the way she tilted her head. Something had gone terribly wrong 5 years ago. And now he had to find out what. Returning to the living room with trembling hands, Daniel saw that Sophie had fallen asleep on the sofa, while Lena was gently tucking a blanket over her. Daniel asked Lena a deeply important question. Was Sophie really her biological daughter? Lena reacted with anger. Of course she was. She had given birth to her at the hospital. Daniel sat down beside her and said that something had been hidden for the past 5 years, and they needed to uncover the truth together. The soft hum of the car engine echoed along the winding mountain road toward St. Mary's Hospital. Lena sat quietly in the passenger seat, casting worried glances at Sophie, who was fast asleep in the back. Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes fixed on the horizon, burning with resolve. He had called ahead and arranged a meeting with the hospital's head of pediatrics, Dr. Holloway, the very man who had been on duty the night of the accident 5 years ago. They were led into a modest but tidy office. Dr. Holloway stood to greet them and offered them seats. When Daniel asked the doctor to take a closer look at Sophie, the man studied her intently, then turned pale as a sheet. He whispered, "That's impossible." Dr. Holloway stood up, walked to the file cabinet, and pulled out a medical folder. With trembling hands, he placed the file on the desk and opened it. What he revealed left everyone in shock. On the night of the accident, it wasn't just Daniel's wife and daughter who were injured. There had been another car involved, carrying a married couple and their young daughter. The adults died on impact, but the child survived. Carmen's biological parents were the ones in that second car, but Carmen herself wasn't with them that night. She was home with her grandparents. Sophie, on the other hand, had been in the car with Daniel's wife, Emily. The condition of the victims' bodies was so severe that the identification process became chaotic. A horrifying mistake had occurred. The 2 little girls were switched. The child Daniel had buried was not his daughter. And Sophie, his real daughter, had survived, but had been misidentified as the daughter of the other couple. She was placed in an orphanage as an unidentified child with no family. Not long after, Lena and her husband at the time, Marcos, applied for adoption, and in a twist of fate, they were given Sophie under a completely new identity. No one in the system ever noticed the original error. Daniel turned to look at Sophie, still seated quietly, her wide blue eyes filled with innocence. His daughter was alive. She had been living just a few miles away for 5 years, and he never knew. But Dr. Holloway had something even more serious to share. He closed the office door, then returned to his desk with a look that suggested he was about to reveal a devastating secret. He explained that not long after the accident, a well-dressed man appeared, claiming to be a lawyer representing Daniel's insurance company. The man carried official-looking documents and seemed to know intimate details about Daniel's family. He said he wanted to spare Daniel the trauma of seeing his daughter in such a terrible state. At the time, Dr. Holloway was still young and inexperienced. He believed the man. The visitor also promised a generous donation to the hospital. A few weeks later, he returned with more papers, claiming the surviving child needed to be placed with a family immediately, and that he had found the perfect couple, Lena and Marcos. Daniel suddenly understood. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated plan. Someone had deliberately removed Sophie from his life. Dr. Holloway continued, describing the man, around 50, tall, graying hair, and a large scar on his left hand. Daniel recognized him instantly. Edward Granger, his former business partner. The same man he had fired and exposed for embezzlement just days before the accident. Everything began to make sense. Granger had always envied Daniel's success, and he had vowed revenge after being exposed. Then came the most chilling part. Dr. Holloway shared that after Sophie was placed with Lena and Marcos, Granger kept visiting the hospital. One day, he overheard Granger on the phone saying, "Daniel must never know the girl survived. His pain is the price." Daniel clenched his fists. Granger hadn't just stolen millions, he had stolen 5 years with his daughter. 5 years of love, growth, and memories that could never be reclaimed. Lena, who had been listening silently all this time, finally spoke. "You have to think of Sophie first. She needs stability, not revenge." Daniel looked at the little girl, still unaware of what was unfolding, and then, completely at ease, she smiled and called him Daddy again. His heart shattered and mended all at once. This time, he knew it without doubt. She really was his daughter. He knelt beside her and whispered softly, "You've done nothing wrong, my love. In fact, you've done something extraordinary. You found your way back to me." But deep down, Daniel knew the real battle was only beginning. Granger had to be brought to justice. But before that, Daniel needed to face the hardest question of all: how to honor and navigate his bond with Lena, the woman who had raised Sophie with love for 4 full years. On the drive back to the estate, the atmosphere was thick with tension and silence. Sophie slept soundly in the back seat, blissfully unaware of how the adult world around her had just been turned upside down. Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the road, focused and quiet, while Lena stared out the window, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Back at the house, Daniel gently carried Sophie into the living room, tucked a blanket around her, and placed a soft kiss on her forehead. For the first time in 5 years, he was able to say goodnight to his daughter. The rush of emotion was so overwhelming, he had to step out of the room to stop himself from breaking down. In the living room, Lena stood frozen near the doorway, her hands still trembling. She couldn't bring herself to look at Daniel. He poured 2 cups of hot tea and handed one to her. They sat across from each other, silent for several minutes. Finally, Lena broke the silence, her voice raw. "Sophie, is everything to me? I've raised her since she was 6 months old. I sang her to sleep every night, taught her to speak, to walk. I lost my husband, and Sophie was the only thing that kept me alive." Daniel nodded. His gaze softened, though the pain in his chest remained sharp. "I understand. I can't deny those years. But she's my daughter, too. I've wept beside an empty grave for 5 years. I lost her without ever knowing she was still breathing, still laughing, just miles away from me." The air between them thickened with emotion. There was no villain in the room. They both loved Sophie, in different ways, but deeply and truly. Lena lowered her head. "So, what now?" Daniel stared into the fire for a long moment. Then he turned to her and said quietly, "I don't want us to have to choose, not between you and me. Not forcing Sophie to lose again. She needs both of us. You are the only mother she's ever known, and I'm the father she deserves to have back." Lena broke into tears, unable to hold them anymore. "I can't accept charity." "This isn't charity," Daniel said gently but firmly. "It's the only way forward. Let's be her parents, together." The room fell silent again. Then Lena looked up, her eyes red. But what about Granger? If he did this once, he could try to destroy everything again. Daniel nodded. "I know, and I won't let him get that chance." That night, with everything finally settled, Daniel and Lena sat together on an old wooden bench in the garden behind the mansion. There were no more confrontations, no accusations, no tears of fury. Only darkness, the soft scent of jasmine, and a sky full of stars wrapping around them like a quiet blanket. Sophie had fallen asleep, wrapped safely in warm blankets, her little heart free from the burdens of adult mistakes. She was dreaming now, and for once her dreams were safe. Lena held a cup of tea in both hands, her eyes turned toward the sky. "The accident took my husband," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was the only one who ever believed in me when the rest of the world walked away. When he died, I thought I would go with him. But then Sophie came. She wasn't mine by blood, but she became my reason to live." Daniel looked at her, his gaze soft. He nodded slowly and spoke. "I lived like a ghost for years. My wife, Emily, died instantly. And my daughter? I thought I buried her myself. Every night I sat in this house imagining what could have been. But now, knowing she's alive, it feels like I've been handed a new heart." They fell into silence. The wind rustled gently through the leaves, bringing a crisp chill, not enough to shiver, just enough to remind them they were alive. Lena took a deep breath and smiled, a faint smile, but full of the weight of all the years she had carried alone. "You know, on that day when I had nothing left, when Sophie and I were starving and freezing in the car, I fell asleep. And I dreamed. I saw a woman. She didn't speak much. She just pointed down a road, and I followed it. That road led me to this house." Daniel turned to her, eyes slightly widened. "At first I was scared. I was heartbroken, because if Sophie was your daughter, then I'd lose her. But then I realized I wasn't losing her. She was being found. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone in loving her." Daniel reached out and gently took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but the trembling was gone. "Let's raise her together," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Not out of guilt or duty, but out of love, because she deserves both of us." Lena nodded, her eyes glistening, filled with quiet hope. They both looked up. Just then, a shooting star streaked across the sky, slicing through the night. Its glittering trail lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough for each of them to whisper a wish into the silence. No words were spoken, but in their hearts they both looked toward a future where Sophie would grow up surrounded by unconditional love, where pain would be healed, and where two broken souls would find themselves again. In the eyes of a child. 3 months had passed since that night, since the truth was laid bare, since Daniel found the daughter he thought he had lost forever, and since Lena, the desperate woman who once stood trembling at his door, became an inseparable part of his life. Daniel's mansion no longer carried the echo of grief. Spring had arrived, and with it the scent of renewal. The garden bloomed. The sun poured through the windows, warming not just the home, but the people within it. That morning, sunlight spilled into the kitchen as Daniel poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. On the table, oatmeal bowls sat beside a basket of warm toast Lena had made. They didn't call it family yet, but every glance, every shared smile, whispered otherwise. Sophie sat outside in the garden, playing with the kitten Daniel had recently adopted. Her soft golden curls shimmered under the sun. She giggled, spinning with joy, her laughter no longer haunted by fear or confusion. Lena stepped out from behind the house, laundry basket in hand, pausing to watch her daughter. Daniel walked out onto the porch with 2 steaming mugs. They sat side by side, shoulder to shoulder, the space between them now filled with quiet trust. "She's so strong," Daniel said, his eyes fixed on Sophie. "I never thought I'd see her smile like that again." Lena smiled faintly. "I never thought she'd open her heart to you so quickly. I was afraid she wouldn't understand. But children don't need explanations. They feel, and she felt love." Daniel gently placed his hand near hers on the table. "Thank you for raising her with your whole heart, and for staying." Lena stayed silent. Many nights she had wondered if she should leave, if she was only standing in the way of Sophie's real father. But every time Sophie looked at her with those eyes and called her Mom, she knew she couldn't go. "I couldn't leave, Daniel. She's my whole world. But I know she needs you too, and I needed somewhere to belong." Daniel smiled softly, for the first time with true light in his eyes. "We've both lost too much. Maybe now it's time to heal. Together." They sat in silence, a warm silence. Sophie ran toward them, holding a bouquet of wild daisies, calling out, "Mommy, Daddy, I made flowers for you." Daniel scooped her up in his arms. Lena brushed her hair gently, smiling as Sophie whispered, "Our house is so pretty. Let's all stay here forever, okay?" Daniel and Lena locked eyes. No fear, no hesitation, just quiet understanding. Since then, life slowly found rhythm. Lena cared for the kitchen, the small garden in the back. Daniel returned to his drawings, not to fill an emptiness, but to create a future. And Sophie? She grew stronger each day, as only children wrapped in love can. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Daniel and Lena sat on the steps, watching Sophie twirl with a flower crown. They spoke of the future, not as lovers, but as 2 souls who had found peace beside one another. "Do you think," Daniel asked gently, "we could become a real family someday?" Lena didn't answer immediately. She simply reached out and held his hand. "I don't know what lies ahead, but I know this: I don't want to be anywhere else." From the garden, Sophie shouted, "Come on, let's race!" They stood. No one tried to win. No one cared. They just ran together. 3 people who had once been broken, now laughing as if pain had never existed. A family, not perfect, but whole, born from loss, built on trust, and held together by love. 1 year had passed since Sophie knocked on their hearts, and everything had changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, like spring giving way to summer. As their second summer together arrived, the house was no longer a mansion of silence, but a true home. One June afternoon, while Sophie played on the swing under the trees, Daniel called Lena out to the garden. He had laid out a picnic blanket with a basket of pastries and 2 glasses of wine. "What's the occasion?" Lena asked with a smile as she sat beside him. Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a sketch, the newest drawing, a small wooden house with smoke curling from the chimney and 3 figures standing at the front, a man, a woman, and a little girl with curly hair. Lena stared at it, her eyes beginning to fill. Daniel turned to her, taking her hand. "My life has been made of designs, but nothing I've ever drawn felt as real and right as you and Sophie." He reached into his pocket and brought out a small velvet box. Inside, a simple but elegant ring with a blue gem, the color of Sophie's eyes. "Lena Carter, you've been the mother to my daughter. Now I want you to be my partner in everything. Will you marry me?" Tears fell down her cheeks as she nodded, speechless. From across the garden, Sophie noticed and ran over, calling, "Mommy? Daddy? What are you two playing?" They both laughed. Daniel scooped her up and kissed her forehead. "We just decided to become a real family, Princess." The wedding was simple and beautiful, held right in the garden where everything began. Friends, neighbors, and everyone who had witnessed their journey were there. Sophie was the honorary flower girl. Wearing a tiny white dress, she led her mother down an aisle of scattered petals. Daniel stood beneath an arch covered in wildflowers, watching Lena approach in a modest white gown. All the grief, all the years lost, seemed to melt away under her soft gaze. When they exchanged vows, Sophie whispered from the front row, "This is a real fairy tale wedding." Another year passed. This summer brought a new miracle. Lena, now pregnant, stood by the window watching Sophie push a toy stroller across the yard. Daniel came up behind her and wrapped his arms gently around her. "You okay?" he whispered. She nodded, placing her hand over his. "We're going to have another little heart beating in this house." Daniel smiled, looking out over their sunlit garden. Emily would be so happy to see this. And I'm grateful that life gave us a second chance. Lena leaned into him. Outside, Sophie shouted with joy, "Baby, your big sister Sophie is waiting for you." Laughter rang through the home, a home that once held only echoes of sorrow, now filled with love, with healing, and soon with one more heartbeat. And sometimes it's the quietest days, the ones where nothing changes, that whisper to you, "You're alive, and that is enough." On a quiet winter morning, the sun rose slowly behind the trees, casting pale light across a thin layer of snow blanketing the ground. Tiny footprints, Sophie's, led from the porch to the garden's edge, where she played among soft flurries like it was her first time seeing magic fall from the sky. Her laughter echoed through the cold stillness, as if declaring to the world that this house, once filled with sorrow, had become a place of warmth. In the kitchen, Lena moved slowly, making coffee with careful hands, as if each scoop of ground beans was part of a sacred ritual, an offering to the quiet that began each day. Outside on the porch, Daniel tidied the small art studio where he now spent his quiet afternoons drawing what words could never fully express. Their life was no longer about moments of drama or pain, nor did it feel stagnant. Somehow, the absence of chaos was its own kind of richness. Perhaps the most extraordinary thing was how ordinary things had become. In a corner of the studio, Daniel found an old wooden box. Inside were blueprints from another lifetime, grand towers, shining glass structures, dreams of greatness he once chased without sleep. He picked up a sketch of a modern skyscraper, looked at it for a moment, then gently set it aside. He opened a fresh notebook and began sketching a small wooden home in a meadow. A white door, a swing beneath a maple tree, smoke curling from the chimney, a framed picture on the wall of a family of 3 wrapped in soft light. Not large, not grand, but the kind of place you see and instantly want to stay. That evening, they sat by the fireplace. Sophie held her baby brother in her arms for the first time, her face a mixture of pride and curiosity. Lena leaned into Daniel's shoulder and whispered, "I never imagined life would bring me here." Daniel smiled, still watching the fire. "Neither did I, but maybe this isn't a destination, just another part of the journey." She looked up at him and asked softly, "And one day, when the kids grow up, when we're no longer here?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the flames and said quietly, "Maybe. We don't have to be here to still be part of their world." A week later, Daniel took Sophie to the frozen lake nearby, a place they'd never visited until that day. The surface of the ice mirrored the pale blue sky like a memory refusing to fade. Holding his hand, Sophie looked up and asked, "Daddy, why is the water so quiet?" He smiled down at her. "Because it's listening." "Listening to what?" she asked. To the things no one dares to say out loud." She was silent for a long moment, then whispered, "Then I want to be like the lake." Daniel squeezed her hand gently, and in that instant he knew. Sophie had grown, not just in height, but in soul. Years from now, when the house belonged to someone else, when the studio gathered dust and the lake remained unchanged, someone might stumble upon an old notebook tucked away in a drawer. Inside, there wouldn't be blueprints of great structures, only a single line, handwritten in faded ink. Happiness is not a destination. It is the smallest sound in the greatest silence. And sometimes all you need to do is listen. Outside, the wind still blew, the snow still fell. The story was not over. And maybe it never needed to end. If you've stayed with us through the final moments of this story, thank you for listening, for opening your heart, for believing that sometimes things don't have to be perfect to be profoundly beautiful. Maybe you've lost something too. Maybe you're still waiting for a knock on the door, for someone to arrive and change everything. But wherever you are, I hope you'll keep listening to the quietest sounds beneath the world's loudest noise. Because often, the most extraordinary things don't come from grand gestures, but from the way we choose to love, to forgive, and to begin again. The story of Daniel, Lena, and Sophie isn't just a story. It's a reminder that family is not just made of blood. It's built with trust, time, and wounds we heal together. In the end, love doesn't ask for perfection. It simply asks us to stay, to show up, to believe in one another again and again. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in another story. Who knows, maybe one that also begins with a knock on the door.